Hi, you're watching India Today Global with me, Ishita Mitra, and the big story we're tracking today is the US election. So, the country has chosen its new president, and this is none other than Donald Trump. A few hours before, he delivered his victory address, promising that America is going to enter a golden age under his administration. So nobody predicted that Trump would get a landslide victory, but here we are. So joining me now is someone who's been closely tracking American politics, Prerna Bountra. She's a Deputy Director, International Relations at Ananta Aspen Center. So thank you, Prerna, for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right. So first thing first, nobody saw this coming. It was thought to be a very closely contested race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So how do you see this election result, and where do you think pollsters went wrong?
Primarily, I think Michigan was really underestimated, not just in terms of the demographics, but in terms of the third party share that Jill Stein was going to take. It seems that the groundwork that the Democratic Party was doing, anytime a responder said that they weren't particularly keen on Trump, they took that to mean either they were undecided or that they would for Kamala Harris, not really thinking that the Green Party had much say there. There's also something to be said about the fact that the primary domestic policy agenda point that the Democrats were using on the ground was abortion rights, being pro-choice.
Yeah.
That's something that's a part of the Michigan state constitution, so that's not particularly troublesome to local voters there. But what is troublesome is the Biden-Harris administration's stance on Gaza and how they've approached their support to Israel. That seems to have struck a chord across many demographics in about 4 swing states.
Exactly. You mentioned Michigan, so we have seen that swing states went to Donald Trump this time. So what do you think led to this development? Like, if you could just break it down for us, what went right for Donald Trump and what went wrong for Kamala Harris?
A couple of things. The first thing is the polling system in America. It seems like it's irrevocably broken. It hasn't been particularly trustworthy since 2016.
Okay.
It swings one way or the other dramatically. It's never particularly in the middle. What went right? Too early to tell. Early numbers do suggest that, particularly in Pittsburgh, so that's the urban male demographic that the Democrats were trying to say. They were under the impression that the rural male demographic is what's going to be troublesome for them and is going to side with the Republicans. Even the urban male demographic has sided with the Republicans, which is something they will have to break down further. It seems that the worrisome areas of Muslim voters and Latino men, as had been predicted, has indeed gone with the Republicans. The impact of the information channels that the Republican voters tend to cater to, the podcasts, the broadcast media channels that did not see enough Democrats on it, other than the last few weeks perhaps, that the lack of a push there seems to have actually made an impact, because a lot of swing state voters have still, in interviews across multiple media channels, said that they just didn't hear enough from Kamala Harris. That's not just to say that a 100-day campaign is not enough. It's to say that the breakdown of left versus right-wing media is become more of a wall than just a breakdown.
You mentioned about the podcast and the campaign strategy. So how would you compare Donald Trump's campaign strategy vis-a-vis Kamala Harris?
The primary difference seems to be that the Republicans, goes to say not just Donald Trump, but the Republican Party knows where their base lives.
True.
They know where to reach to their voters. They know what is the most effective way to communicate their own thought processes to them. The Democrats have an idealistic way of going about it. Now, of course, to be fair, they have a more fractured coalition. There's more demographics to appease to. So there's multiple areas on vehicles of information to access. But having said that they still limited themselves to the ad buy phenomena, the logic that still pervaded the early aughts, the strategy applied by Barack Obama's campaign. A lot of whose senior campaign staffers were in Kamala Harris's shotgun campaign. So it seems like they haven't adapted to the new annals of information yet.
All right. So we saw that there was a lot of chatter about Kamala Harris becoming the first woman president US would have. So do you think America is not ready or wasn't ready to have a woman president at this point?
I feel like that's a very simplistic, generalized extrapolation to take from this. It's not just about gender. I'm certain gender has a role to play. I'm certain the race, the fact that her race is split, she's not just black. She's
also
not
a woman of color.
Yes. She's not just African American, she's not just South Asian in descent. She's both. And how that translates into certain homes, how this communication strategy adopted at what point which part of her identity should be used that does not seem to have landed. So I'm not sure which part of the cross section of her identity, which intersectionality let Democrats down this time. What I can think about is when you do have these historic demographic standpoints working for you, so to speak, it's more about identifying where can you leverage them. If you're leveraging them in your own echo chambers, in the urban women or in the senior women who are already pro-choice,
Yeah.
they don't really need to see that it's a woman. All they need to see is that their abortion rights will be protected. So where can you leverage this? They just didn't leverage it well enough, it seems. Because if you think about it, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. If America were truly sexist, she wouldn't get 3 million extra votes. It was the Electoral College that let her down. Here, Kamala Harris lost both the Electoral College and the popular vote. So
Yes.
it's for the Americans to do a post-mortem and tell us later.
All right. Trump has been promising a lot of changes on the immigration front. He said that he's going to carry out the largest deportation in the US history. So, what changes are we going to witness in immigration policy, especially with regards to Indians?
In terms of the deportation, I am not particularly sure if Indians need to worry that much about it. The deportation applies more to illegal immigrants. That's not a demographic that Indians fall into a lot. There are some illegal immigrants that are of Indian origin. Of course, there was a plane full of Indian illegal or unregistered, let's say people who had applied but hadn't actually received their immigrant status. That makes them, while in process, still illegal. They were deported, a plane full of them, a few weeks or months ago. Having said that, a majority of the illegal immigrants that Donald Trump, the Republican Party, is looking at deporting are from the southern border. They're Mexican in origin, they're Latino in origin in terms of the Puerto Rican immigrants, the Cuban immigrants, there's Central Asian immigrants, there's immigrants that they have been absorbed into the American system that have fled persecution from a lot of the wars that America was involved in that haven't received status. So with that said, even the Democratic Party has tightened its stance on immigration. So even if Kamala Harris had won, illegal immigration would have had a tough time. Where Indian workers and students should be a little worried now is H-1B visas were the applications, not just the allotment of them. The applications were dramatically reduced in 2019 to 2020, and the granting of it was just stopped under Donald Trump in the last year of his presidency. So that's a lot of Indian workers that need to be worried there.
Yeah.
That's medium to high skill workers. Really high skill workers under STEM, as STEM cross interacts with national security analysts. So that's engineers who want to get into the semiconductor business, engineers who want to get into data security. They might still be safe, but that's a very small subset of Indians. So yes, Indian high skilled workers should be worried. Of course, there is the fact that in passing, Donald Trump made a statement during the campaign that Indian students studying in American university, as an extension of international students studying in American university, if you graduate from said universities, you would be in line for an automatic green card. A statement that his campaign revoked later. So he has gone back and forth on that. But it's an unpredictable president. It's an unpredictable era. Just the fact that it has slipped somewhere during the campaign should give I guess, a sliver of hope to Indians, that at least Indian students, that by the end of their undergraduate degrees or their graduate degrees, perhaps Trump he doesn't have another term to run for. Perhaps he has enough capital to muscle his way through the other parts of his party and convince them to let Indians get green cards. We'll see.
Yeah. Talking about unpredictability, so we have seen, Trump has made a lot of statements about boosting ties with India during his campaign. He's talked about Prime Minister Modi, praising his leadership, while also accusing India of being an abuser when it comes to imposing tariffs. So how do you see this? What would be the impact of Trump's presidency on India-US ties, specifically when it comes to economic cooperation?
That is something our foreign minister has also said, that the two areas where India will likely have some amount of difficulty under a Trump administration would likely be immigration and trade.
Yes.
Now that automatically means that in strategic and defense parts of our relationship, we should coast a little smoothly, that there is the common threat of China. So that just allows us to have faith in the fact that our trade, our strategic ties under Quad, under the larger Indo-Pacific schemes, under the multilateral fora in which we sit together as counterbalances to China, those should persist. Trade will continue to be a problem, and trade is split into a couple of things. Of course, President Trump's relationship with Prime Minister Modi hopefully will help smooth some of the threats down, smooth the execution of them down. There's also something to be said about Robert Lighthizer, who was President Trump's trade representative in his first term, who could perhaps get a senior position, even Secretary of Treasury in the next term. He, in
Okay.
his book, has said that he had good relationships with his counterpart, Piyush Goyal, and before that with Suresh Prabhu. While all of the people mentioned here have said that India, according to them, is protectionist and they want India to open up market access for American goods, I'm not too sure how we should calculate. It's too premature. Some calculations that I can rattle off are if Trump goes through with the threat of imposing a blanket tariff on India, among other countries, of 10% of
Yeah.
tariff on all goods, then there is a report by Bloomberg Economics a few weeks ago that said that by 2028, under such a tariff, the Indian GDP could shrink by 0.1%,
That
which
is
is
a
a
lot.
scary,
Yeah.
it's a scary prospect. But then there are other reports by companies like Nomura that also say there is a counterbalance to the fact that if China gets the biggest share of the promised threatened tariff, which is up to 60%, even
Yeah.
though the Chinese premier, the President Xi Jinping has said they'll just devalue the yuan to the same percentage point that they're getting a tariff on, which will lead to a currency war, which leads to other secondary problems. But India might have secondary benefits as the China plus one strategy. When a country is against China from a trade perspective, they have to look at alternate sources for cheaper goods. India does remain a viable alternative that way. So India could get some manufacturing deals. India could become a supply chain hub. India could become one part in the larger spoke of reshuffled trade channels that benefits from the adversarial relationship that US will now have with China. To that effect, does India benefit from for instance, the auto sector reshuffle because the auto parts going from China will decrease? Does India benefit from the fact that Trump is fossil fuel friendly and India, even though is on a net zero path to 2070, still needs to increase coal production because we have our energy needs are going to grow by 2.7%. The world's are going to grow by 0.6. So that should help the Indian commodity prices, which will eventually help the consumer down the chain. There are counterbalances. India will suffer, but India will also fare better than the rest of the world in the secondary impacts.
All right. There are also other issues mentioned, such as Panoon case, or when it comes to India buying oil from Russia, or human rights issue. So, how do you think these issues will play out under Trump's presidency?
I'll try to be brief about them in reverse order. The oil sanctions with Russia, there is some hope there because Donald Trump is more pro-Putin, more pro-Russia than he
Yeah.
is than his predecessors. Of course, the fact that Vladimir Putin has already made a statement that he's looking to reset relations with the United States is helpful that way.
Yeah.
But the larger impact of the oil sanction on India had already been stabilized because once India adhered to the G7 $60 per barrel rate, US was indeed actually depending on India to balance the global oil prices by buying that, by making it, by keeping it in India and refining it in India, by making it an Indian commodity. So India shouldn't be too far off there. India should actually fare better a little bit there. The larger relationship with Russia was balanced, so we should be good either way. We can't be too sure actually about his relationship with Russia as it relates to trade because we faced some scrutiny from the Americans about purchasing S-400 defense systems from Russians.
Yeah.
So there will be a balance there again. On the Panu case, the case that's already in the New York courts, that I don't see being wished away. Once it's in a bench, the maximum a new government can do is deal with the background elements that are not a part of the main litigation. So, for instance, they can now perhaps exert control or exert some pressure over the presiding judge to not summon our national security advisor. That's something that the diplomatic channel can do. But the basis of uh, pushing a deal, pushing a plea, which India has already pled, pushing for the motions to actually put it to trial. Those are the procedural procedures of the legal case. They can't be wished away. But I don't see in a Republican administration, I don't see it making its way back up to our home minister or our national security advisor.
All right. So this election is also going to have impacts globally. And when we talk about two wars, so Donald Trump has made a lot of statements saying that had he been in power when these wars started, they would have never taken place. So how do you think Trump would proceed with regards to Russia-Ukraine war and, of course, what's going on in West Asia?
The West Asia answer is cleaner that way because he has not made any statements that are too far off of the Biden administration's. He supports Israel the way the current administration does. He might take a stronger hand on Iran, so the larger
Yeah.
conflict might get limited, but there is an unpredictability there too. If you needle Iran the wrong way, Iran has a slightly higher risk appetite than an average country. So we don't know whether it's going to stop immediately, but we do know that he's not going to ask Israel to,
Yeah.
from a humanitarian perspective, to stop whatever he's doing because Gazans are suffering. That's not going to happen. On the Russia-Ukraine perspective, we all know Ukraine was the one country that was supposed to truly worry about a Trump administration.
Yeah.
So their worries have come to life. NATO is worried, I'm sure. All the statements that have come from European leaders are warm, as they should be, as they need to be.
Yeah.
But I think NATO has been preparing for about a year and a half by back-channel meetings with the Trump
Exactly.
team.
They have been cautious about this.
Yes, so some member countries have already been planning to meet their 2% defense expenditure target. Some of them have been upping it to have it at 3% from a very Indian Sarojini logic of if we aim for 3, perhaps we land at 2 by the time Trump comes into power. So they are prepped for it. They know that they have to take the brunt of the defense expenditure if they intend on defending Ukraine. What we can assume now that Ukraine, for at least the medium-term future, will not get grants or resources to attack Russia inland. So the counteroffensive might stop. The defense might not immediately stop. And perhaps just that buffer window in which the defense is still continued by the Americans might give NATO enough time to pull up their socks, but it's unlikely. NATO needs to create its own defense production supply chain top to bottom. That's hard to do.
So are we going to see any end to this Russia-Ukraine war, when it comes to involvement of US?
The most likely scenario now is that the stalemate that they've been in for a while, they just keep having counteroffensives. It's a 1 step forward, 2 step back thing for the last 2.5 years.
Yeah.
It's more likely than not that in the impatience of Donald Trump wanting to end it and cement his legacy, try to look like a man of his word, they'll just want to propose a ceasefire where the territories gained so far stay with the countries that have gained them. But that's a logical expectation. We can't be sure whether Ukraine will end up losing more than just that.
All right. You were mentioning before about the Secretary of Treasury who could take that position. So how do you think Trump's dream team would look like? He also gave a special shout out to Elon Musk that he would try to accommodate him and his team. So who do you think who all have chances to become part of that team?
That's an interesting question because some names have been floated. And Donald Trump has a particular tendency that if you put out there in the media that someone has a chance to be in his cabinet, just to prove you wrong, Donald Trump and his senior advisors will say, I'm not going to appoint this person even though he's the best person for the job. So that puts some people perhaps in jeopardy. He's made some claims that RFK Jr., who was also a presidential candidate, could get perhaps a job in the health department.
Yes.
Who knows? He's made claims that Elon Musk might get a new job fashioned for him to run an efficiency commission because he does have a private sector life that he can't leave, and he can't abandon his stock takes to take that government job. He'll have to find some loophole around that. There are some thoughts that see the BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, for instance, he's been considered for Treasury Secretary. That's a wild thought. During an appearance at a radio show, I think Trump said he has a few good choices for Defense Secretary. He named at random like Senator Tom Cotton. He named Representative Mike Waltz. He named the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. There's 7 to 8 names floating around. Yeah. I know that there are, from his previous team, very few people have stayed silent about his next new campaign. So the people who stayed silent are the only ones that now get a chance to be considered. Some names among them remain Matt Pottinger, who was a key architect of the Trump-China strategy in term 1. If he gets a role again, that's good for India. That's good for many countries in the Indo-Pacific. The former representative Mike Gallagher, who was the chairman of the House Committee on Managing China competition with the Chinese Communist Party, he might have a chance, and he would again be good for the Indo-Pacific because he is solid on China. So let's see.
All right, my last question to you is, we have seen a lot of world reactions coming in on Trump getting elected. So if you could just categorize all those reactions for us into losers and winners. You already described that how this could be a nightmare for Zelensky. So my last question for you is that.
The biggest loser here does become Ukraine, I guess.
Yeah.
The unexpected winner is Russia. India was supposed to be a winner regardless of who won. The European Union's made a statement, but they have a historic tie, so let's not call them a loser yet. Let's just call them a very anxious friend. Outside of all of them, Bibi Netanyahu has made a very interesting statement, which I still can't particularly decode. He says a historic comeback, and that's interesting because they've had their ups and downs, these two.
True. Okay, just one more question for you. Do you think if Democrats had not kicked out Biden and made way for Harris, do you think the situation would have been any different?
I don't particularly think so. Perhaps he would have had a better vote share. We can't say. The things that didn't work for Vice President Harris
are the things that could have also not worked for Biden.
Precisely, and even worse, because we don't know how cartoonish the age narrative would have gone. President Biden's gaffes, so to speak, his literal physical missteps now on the way to his helicopter, on the way to his plane, the momentum of a TV camera on him reduced when Vice President Harris became the nominee. But we don't know exactly how cartoonish all of that would have gotten. We don't know whether he would have lost a bigger vote share. We don't know whether even New York would have stopped taking him seriously because they would think that he would perhaps not make it through the next term. So we can't say. What we can say is Gaza and the sympathy that Arab Americans, Muslim Americans have for Palestinians, that's something that persists. Perhaps the anger for that could have been multiplied if it were Biden, because he is the president, he's not the vice president. So he's the face of those decisions. We can't say. What we can say is a 100-day campaign clearly seems like was not enough.
All right. Again, last question to you is, how much do you think these wars impacted the decision? Because you mentioned Israel-Hamas war.
Well, it cost them Michigan, it cost them a couple of suburbs in Pennsylvania, so that's 2 swing states.
Yeah.
It cost them quite a bit. I'm not sure entirely how much it must have cost them in the southern and midwestern belt, because that's all typically Republican anyway. But it cost them more than I think they anticipated at the beginning, which clearly now they are coming to terms with the fact. Is Russia, Ukraine, I think the anger in Americans about the rising cost, the inflation crisis, the fact that they can't afford anything, not just the housing element, the fact they can't afford their groceries, and a lot of them tend to associate that with the American expenditures in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant whether that the American inflation numbers are lower than the global average.
Yeah.
The way defense expenditures are presented to Americans is that if you spend $1 billion, that has a direct proportionate impact on the price of gas or the price of cereal for a person in the deep Midwest. So as far as that is considered, Ukraine war had an impact. About a year and a half ago, Israel and Gaza is a bigger deal right now.
All right. So just summarize this for us. Next few months under Trump's presidency, what are we looking at?
We're looking at him appointing key cabinet positions. We're looking at him returning all of the phone calls he must have received finally. We're looking at the Biden administration setting a transition pathway for India in particular, to see whether things like the deals we made on having an indigenous semiconductor military chip, whether that survives and how will that happen. We're looking at Trump trying to figure out how to walk back the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and Biden trying to figure out how to make sure most of the money promised in the IRA is given away so that it can't be retracted. We are going to see how Iran behaves itself in anticipation of a Trump presidency, and we're going to see how Ukraine approaches other partners now that it can't count on the entirety of its monetary defense needs on America.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Prerna, for speaking to India Today Global and helping us understand this election outcome and its impact on the world. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
All right.